Ah, welcome. You've arrived just in time. I was about to share a story. Not one of heroes or triumphs. No, these are tales of shadows, of fear, and the choices that linger long after they are made. Some stories are meant to teach, and others to warn. These, well, they're cautionary tales. Whispered reminders that the dark still holds its secrets, and that the monsters under your bed were never just in your imagination. So gather your courage and listen closely. The story begins now. The Abyssal Hymn, Act 1. The first time I heard the Abyssal Hymn, it was over a speaker that barely worked. I didn't stop the scientists in the briefing room from leaning forward like they were listening to some sacred revelation. I'll admit, it was odd. A low resonant hum that didn't sound like anything I'd heard before. Not mechanical, not natural. Something else entirely. They played it again, louder this time, and I felt it in my chest. A deep vibration, steady and rhythmic. It wasn't the sound that bothered me, though. It was the way the room felt after it stopped, like it had taken something with it. They called it the Abyssal Hymn. A signal, they said, recorded after a seismic event in the Mariana Trench. The tremor had torn open a new chasm, deeper and wider than anything we'd ever mapped for, and the sound, the hymn, was coming from inside. That's why I was here, in a room full of people who couldn't care less about the pressure outside a sub or what it was like to be 3 inches of steel away from death. They needed someone to take them down there, and I was the guy for the job. Now, I wasn't exactly their first pick. Pilots for these kinds of missions usually have decades of experience. Me? I had 5 years under my belt, a few tough dives, and a spotless record. That's what got me on their radar, was the record. After a few long conversations and many, many interviews, finally they told me I'd be piloting the Aegir, their newest submersible. Sleek, reinforced, and supposedly foolproof. "You're just there to drive," they said. "The scientists will handle the important stuff." I told myself I didn't care what they thought of me. The paycheck was good, and it wasn't like I'd never been underestimated before. Still, there was something about this mission that felt off. The team was small, just the three of us going down in the Aegir. Elaine O'Connell was the geologist, Irish, bubbly, and endlessly curious. She was the kind of person who could make rock formations sound like the most exciting thing on the planet. She didn't walk into a room, she bounced into it, all smiles and wide-eyed enthusiasm. It was contagious, whether you wanted it to be or not. "You don't mind me asking, do you?" she said during the briefing, leaning towards me. "What's the deepest you've gone? Must have been incredible." 7,000 meters, I said. Her eyes widened. 7,000? Was it quiet, peaceful, scary? "All three," I said, trying not to smile. Then there was Lucien Moreau, the biologist. French, sharp-tongued, and as arrogant as they come. If Elaine's excitement made her endearing, Lucien's confidence made him unbearable. He talked like he was doing the world a favor just by showing up. "Is a signal?" he said during the same briefing, standing in front of the room like he was the star of the show. "A message, perhaps. An invitation, even. The question is who sent it." "Or what?" Elaine chimed in. Lucien smirked. "Let's not jump to conclusions. Nature is full of surprises. We'll find a rational explanation, I'm sure." "Right," I said under my breath. "Rational." The morning of the dive, the Nereus 5 buzzed with activity. Technicians checked and rechecked every system, while researchers debated over data. I ran through my own checklist aboard the Aegir, inspecting every thruster, control, emergency system. Lane was first to join me in the sub. She climbed aboard with a grin, her boots clanking on the metal floor. "This is amazing," she said, spinning in place to take it all in. "I've read about subs like this, but I've never actually been inside one." "You'll love it," I said, adjusting the pilot seats. "Just don't touch anything unless I tell you to." She laughed, dropping into her seat with an exaggerated salute. "Yes, sir." Lucien followed a few minutes later, carrying a sleek case of equipment. He looked around with a critical eye before settling into his chair. "He's smaller than I imagined," he said, his tone flat. "It's bigger than it looks," I replied. He raised an eyebrow but didn't respond. We launched just after dawn, the sub detaching from the ship with a soft hiss of pressurized air. The Aegir sank into the water, its thrusters humming steadily as we began our descent. The first few hundred meters were uneventful, just blue water and the occasional school of fish. Elaine pressed her face to the viewport, her breath fogging the glass. "Look at them," she said, pointing. "Jonah, slow us down. I've never seen this species before." "It's a fish," Lucian said dismissively, not even glancing up. Elaine rolled her eyes. "Oh, thank you, Professor. I never would have guessed." The Aegir began its descent, steady, the thrusters humming like a heartbeat. At these depths, the ocean wasn't just dark, it was alive in its silence, pressing in from all sides like a presence you couldn't shake. The first few hundred meters passed without incident, the sunlight filtering through the water in faint ribbons before disappearing entirely. Elaine, seated on my right, practically vibrated with excitement. She pressed her face to the viewport, her breath fogging the glass as she pointed out anything and everything of interest. "Look at those markings on the rock face," she said, her voice full of awe. "That's tectonic activity for you, pushing layers of sediment up over millions of years. Fascinating, isn't it?" I glanced over, managing a small smile. "If you say so, O'Connell." "You don't think this is incredible?" she asked, grinning. "We're looking at geological history written in stone. Literal chapters of Earth's past." "I think it looks like rocks," I said, earning a playful shove to my shoulder. Lucian, seated behind us, didn't look up from his monitor. "It's rocks, Elaine. He's not wrong. Let's not over-dramatize the obvious. Maybe if you spent a little less time with your fish samples, you'd learn to appreciate what the rest of the planet has to offer." "Fish samples," Lucian repeated with a smirk. "If by fish samples you mean the most sophisticated and diverse ecosystem on the planet, then yes, I'll stick to my fish samples." The bickering was definitely not new, but it was oddly comforting. It made the empty silence of the ocean feel less oppressive, less alive. By the time we passed 2,000 meters, the light had faded entirely, leaving only the dim glow of the Aegir's exterior lights to cut through the dark. I adjusted the thrusters, keeping the sub steady as the water thickened with pressure. Elaine's voice broke the silence again. "Jonah, slow us down. Look at that." I eased off the thrusters, letting the sub drift as I followed her gaze. Outside the viewport, a cluster of tiny bioluminescent creatures floated near the edge of a rock formation, their light flickering like fireflies in the dark. Elaine leaned closer, her breath fogging the glass again. "Aren't they beautiful?" Lucian barely glanced up. "They're displaced," he said dismissively. "The seismic activity likely destroyed their usual habitat. They're scavengers now." Elaine tilted her head. "They're acting strange, though. Look at the patterns. They're moving erratically." "It is displacement behavior," Lucian insisted. "They'll adapt or die. That's how nature works." She rolled her eyes, but didn't argue further, her attention drawn back to the creatures. We continued our descent, the pressure increasing with every meter. At 5,000 meters, the water grew unnaturally still. Faint currents that usually drifted through the depths had vanished, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. Even the bioluminescent life had disappeared, leaving us alone in the dark. Elaine sat back in her seat, her bubbly energy dimming. "It's emptier than I expected," she murmured. "That's normal at these depths," I said, keeping my voice calm. "The deeper you go, the less life you'll find." "But not none," she said, glancing to me. "There should still be something." Lucian snorted. "You're expecting a nature documentary, O'Connor? What we are seeing is perfectly natural. Sparse life is the rule here, not the exception." Elaine didn't respond, but I could see the doubt in her expression. She wasn't convinced, and neither was I. At 8,000 meters, the hymn began to shift. What had started as a faint, almost imperceptible vibration was now an undeniable presence resonating through the whole like the pulse of something alive. Elaine tilted her head. "You feel that?" "It's just sound waves," Lucian said, though his tone was sharper now. "Resonance from the chasm walls. Nothing unusual." "Doesn't feel like sound," she said softly. "It feels deeper, like it's in my chest." Lucian scoffed, but there was an edge of unease to his voice. "Don't let your imagination run wild. It's a natural phenomenon, nothing more." I kept my focus on the controls, my hands steady despite the growing tension in the cabin. When we reached the chasm's edge, it was like staring into the mouth of the earth. The drop was sudden and sheer, the walls jagged and irregular, their surfaces glowing faintly with an eerie greenish-blue light. Massive spires jutted out at odd angles, their surfaces slick and reflective like polished obsidian. Elaine gasped. "Jonah, stop the sub, look at that." I brought the Aegir to a halt, letting the light sweep across the chasm walls. The spires were covered in swirling patterns, their shapes almost organic. The faint glow pulsed in time with the hymn, casting shifting shadows that made the entire structure seem alive. Elaine's voice was hushed. "These aren't natural. They can't be." Lucien leaned forward, squinting at the spires. "Mineral formations," he said dismissively. "The glow is a byproduct of bacterial growth. It's perfectly natural." "They look deliberate," Elaine said, her voice tinged with awe. "Like they've been carved." "By what?" Lucien asked, his smirk returning. "Nature doesn't use tools." Elaine ignored him, her eyes fixed on the spires. "Jonah, take us closer." As we descended into the chasm, the glow intensified, bathing the Aegir in a dim, otherworldly light. The spires grew larger and more intricate, their patterns twisting and curling in ways that defied logic. Elaine snapped picture after picture, her excitement bubbling back to the surface. "This is incredible," she said. "It's like nothing I've ever seen before." Lucien muttered something under his breath, his eyes glued to his monitor. The hymn grew louder with every meter, its rhythm pounding in my chest like a second heartbeat. I tightened my grip on the controls, my jaw clenching as I tried to focus. By the time we reached 10,000 meters, the glow had become blinding, and the hymn wasn't just sound anymore. It was pressure, weight, something that pressed against my mind and made it hard to think. At the center of the cavern, something moved. Elaine's voice was barely a whisper. "Jonah, stop. Look." I froze, my hands hovering over the controls. The lights from the Aegir swept across the cavern floor, casting fractured beams through the inky blackness. Fragments of a massive coiled structure shimmered in and out of view, each section rippling like wet silk. The light refracted off its surface in unnatural ways, bending and scattering into patterns that defied logic. It wasn't just massive. It was infinite in its complexity, its presence filling the cavern with an oppressive weight. Every ripple seemed deliberate, as though the creature were shifting itself to better serve us. "Is it alive?" Lucien's voice broke the silence. There was an uncharacteristic tremble to it, a quiver that I couldn't quite pin down. Fear, fascination, or maybe something more. Elaine didn't answer immediately. Her wide eyes were fixed on the shifting surface of the structure, her usual energy subdued by the overwhelming presence before us. "It's moving," she said at last, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not the currents. That's deliberate." The hymn pulsed again. The sound had deepened, resonating through the sub with a vibration that pressed into my chest like a second heartbeat. It wasn't just noise, it was physical, a presence that crawled through every nerve, filling my skull with a low, thrumming hum that wouldn't stop. "Jonah," Elaine said, her voice tight. "Pull us back." "I'm trying," I replied, my hands steady on the controls. I reversed the thrusters, easing power into the engines. The sub lurched slightly, but then the movement stopped. We weren't going anywhere. The water around us felt heavy, almost solid, as though something unseen had wrapped itself around the Aegir, anchoring us in place. "Something's wrong," I muttered, flicking through the system readouts. Everything was green, the thrusters were responding, but the sub barely moved. "The thrusters are working, but we're not moving like we should." Lane's knuckles whitened as she gripped the edge of her station, her breathing shallow. She glanced at her console, her voice sharp and urgent. What could do that? The water density isn't normal. Lucian didn't answer her. He was leaning forward in his seat, his pale face lit faintly by the glow from his monitor. His eyes were locked on the massive structure, unblinking, with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Then the creature moved. A section of its coiled mass began to unfurl, the movement slow and deliberate. The shimmering surface rippled with every shift, sending waves of refracted light across the cavern walls. The shadows cast by the creature didn't behave like ordinary shadows. They writhed and twisted independently of the light, curling along the jagged walls in patterns that felt almost alive. Elaine inhaled sharply, her voice cracking as she grabbed her console for support. Jonah, pull us back, now! I forced the controls harder, pushing the thrusters to their limits. The engines groaned in protest, their vibrations humming through the cabin. The sub shifted, but whatever was holding us didn't let go. And then the eyes opened. Hundreds, maybe thousands of them. The glowing orbs blinked, open in perfect unison, their faint bioluminescent light casting the entire cavern in an eerie glow. Each eye was massive, easily the size of the Aegir's viewport, and they all gazed directly at us. Elaine let out a sharp gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. Oh my God, she whispered, her voice trembling. Lucian leaned closer to the viewport, his face pale, his lips slightly parted. But it wasn't fear that gripped him. It was something far worse. Reverence. He's looking at us, he murmured, his tone low, almost worshipful. Elaine turned to him, incredulous. You're admiring it. Lucian, that thing is staring at us like we're its next meal. Lucian didn't respond. His focus remained entirely on the creature, his eyes reflecting the pink glow of the massive blinking orbs outside. The hymn surged again, its rhythm quickening. The vibrations grew stronger, the rattling, the whole, and reverberating through my skull. My vision blurred, and suddenly, I wasn't in the sub anymore. Images flooded my mind, sharp and alien, burning themselves into my thoughts. A city submerged beneath black waves, its spires broken and crumbling. Shadowy figures knelt in the dark, their faces featureless, their hands raised towards something massive and coiled in the depths. Sacrifices. Worship. Oblivion. The images vanished as quickly as they had come, leaving me gasping for air. My hands tightened on the controls as I forced myself to focus, my heart pounding against my ribs. Jonah? Elaine's voice was a lifeline cutting through the haze. We have to leave. I know, I said through gritted teeth, forcing thrusters harder. The engines roared, but the sub didn't move. The water had become a wall, a vice holding us in place no matter how much power I fed into the engines. The creature's tendrils appeared next. They unfurled from its coiled mass, twisting and curling through the water like living smoke. They shimmered with the same oily iridescence as its surface, their edges flickering in and out of visibility as though they weren't entirely real. One of the tendrils brushed against the sub, sending a jolt through the hole that rattled the entire cabin. Elaine flinched. Her hands gripped her consoles tightly. It's touching us, she whispered, her voice barely audible. He's probing us, Lucian said, his voice disturbingly calm. Elaine turned to him, her eyes blazing. Probing? Lucian is not a scientist, it's a predator. He turned to her slowly, his expression eerily blank. His usual smugness was gone, replaced by something colder, something unfamiliar. You don't know that, he said quietly. You're letting your fear cloud your judgment. Before she could respond, the tendril pressed against the viewport. The shimmering tendril pressed against the viewport, flaring with a ghostly, otherworldly glow that filled the cabin with pale, flickering light. The patterns on its surface shifted constantly, veins of molten silver twisting in impossible geometries. Elaine's breath caught, her eyes locked on the tendril. It's looking at us. Not with its eyes, with this, it's feeling us. It's incredible, Lucian murmured, his voice almost reverent. He leaned closer to the viewport, ignoring the violent shudder of the sub as another tendril brushed against the hull. Do you see how it moves, how it reacts to the light? This isn't just a creature, it's an intelligence. Elaine tore her gaze from the viewport and glared at him. Intelligence? It's trying to crush us, Lucian. He turned to her, his expression eerily calm. It hasn't harmed us. It's testing us, studying us. Don't let fear blind you to what we are witnessing. Elaine stared at him, her face a mix of disbelief and fury. You're insane. The hymn surged again, its rhythm a chaotic drumbeat that pounded in my skull. I gritted my teeth, gripping the consoles as I fought to keep the Aegir steady. The tendrils tightened their grip on the sub, their shimmering forms pulsing in time with the hymn. The vibrations rattled the cabin, shaking the instruments and flickering the lights. Jonah, we have to go. I know, I snapped, flipping switches and forcing the thrusters to full power. The engines roared, but the sub barely moved. Lucian didn't flinch at the shuddering walls. He was staring out the viewport, his lips moving silently as if he were whispering to the creature. Elaine noticed it too. What the hell are you doing? She demanded. He didn't respond. The tendrils pressed harder, the sub groaning under the strain. Cracks spiderwebbed across the viewport, faint but unmistakable. My heart pounded as I activated the emergency ballast release. With a violent jolt, the ballast tanks dumped their weight and the sub shot upward. The tendrils recoiled, their shimmering forms snapping back as though burned. The creature let out a guttural roar that reverberated through the water, shaking the cavern to its foundation. The spires lining the walls cracked and crumbled, shards of glowing stone tumbling into the abyss. The light from them flickered and died, leaving the cavern in near total darkness, save for the faint bioluminescence of the creature. The ascent was brutal. The Aegir groaned and shuddered, the thrusters screaming as I pushed them harder than I should have. The hymn didn't fade as we climbed. It grew louder, more dissonant, its rhythm fractured and jagged. Elaine clung to her console, her knuckles white. We're not moving fast enough, she said, her voice tight with panic. We can't go faster, I barked. The pressure dropped. I know, she snapped, her voice cracking. She stopped, her eyes darting toward Lucian. He hadn't moved. Lucian, she said sharply. What's wrong with you? He blinked slowly as though waking from a dream. When he turned to her, the faint glow from the creature's tendrils still reflected in his eyes. He's still with us, he said softly. Elaine froze, her face paling. What are you talking about? Lucian didn't answer. I glanced at him briefly, my pulse quickening. His expression was distant, his usual smugness replaced by something cold, detached. His hands were clasped tightly in his lap, his gaze unfocused. Lucian, I said, forcing my voice to remain steady. What do you mean it's still with us? He turned his head slowly, his lips curling into a faint smile that made my stomach churn. You'll see. Elaine recoiled, her breath hitching. Jonah, he's right. Something's wrong with him. I didn't respond. My focus was on the controls, on keeping the ascent steady despite the roaring thrusters and the pressure warnings flashing across my screen. But in the back of my mind, I couldn't shake the feeling that Lucian was right. The creature wasn't done with us. Even as the Aegir climbed, the hymn followed, relentless and invasive. The fractured rhythm pulsed through the hole like a living thing, reverberating in my chest, crawling through my thoughts. Every beat of it felt sharper, heavier, a reminder that we were not free. Elaine leaned forward, her breathing was shallow. Her hands shook as she tightened her grip on the edge of her console. Jonah, what's happening? The pressure, the turbulence, it's not normal. I know, I said through gritted teeth. I forced the controls to stay steady as the sub groaned under the strain. The turbulence wasn't coming from above. It was chasing us, a ripple in the water like a predator on our tail. This isn't the chasm anymore. It's the creature. It's holding on. Elaine's gaze darted towards Lucian. He hadn't moved since we left the cavern, his posture rigid, his eyes fixed on the viewport. "Lucian," she said, her voice sharp and trembling. "Talk to us. What's going on? What do you mean when you said it's still with us?" He slowly turned, his movements deliberate, like someone waking from a dream. When he spoke, his voice was soft, eerily calm. "You already know, Elaine. You felt it. It is not just chasing us. It's inside us. It's a part of us now. You already know, Elaine. You felt it. It's not just following us. It's inside us. A part of us now." Elaine recoiled, her voice rising in panic. "What the hell are you talking about? You sound like it's taking you over or something." Lucian's lips curled into a faint smile, but it wasn't comforting. "Taking me over? No, it's not possession, Elaine. It's understanding. That's what you can see. He doesn't want to harm us. He wants to know us." I tightened my grip on the console, my pulse racing. "Lucian, stop. That thing almost killed us back there. We saw what it did to him, the tendrils, the way it crushed the cavern around us. How the hell can you call that an understanding?" He shook his head slowly as though pitying me. "You're thinking too small, Jonah. That wasn't an attack. That was communication. Primitive, yes, but deliberate." Elaine slammed her fist on the console, her voice cracked. "It almost killed us. Well, that's communication. I don't want to know what it thinks violence is." The sub jolted violently, the lights flickering as a metallic groan echoed through the cabin. Warning lights flared on my console, pressure alarms screaming. Elaine grabbed her seat, her knuckles white. "What was that?" I scanned the readouts, my stomach sinking. Pressure drop, rapid, localized. It's not natural, the water's being displaced. The lights cut out, plunging us into darkness. For a moment, all I could hear was the thrumming of the hymn, louder now, pounding through the hole like a drum beat. And then the lights came back, flickering weakly, casting long, uneven shadows across the cabin. Lucian stood. His movements were slow and deliberate, as though the air around him were thicker and heavier. The faint glow of the emergency lights reflected in his eyes, giving them an even more unnatural sheen. "Lucian, sit down." Elaine snapped, her voice high and panicked. He ignored her, stepping closer to the viewport. His hand reached out, brushing the glass, his fingers trembling slightly. "He's still here," he murmured, his voice almost reverent. "It hasn't left us. It won't leave us." "Lucian," I barked, trying to snap him out of it. "Whatever it's doing to you, fight it." He turned to face us, his expression unnervingly serene. "You don't understand," he said, his voice calm but filled with an eerie certainty. "This isn't an attack. This is a gift." Elaine stood, her fear giving way to anger. "A gift? Lucian, do you even hear yourself? That thing is trying to break us, and you're acting like it's some kind of benevolent god." Lucian tilted his head, studying her like one might study a stubborn child. "Benevolent? No, it's not human. It doesn't think in terms of good or evil. It's beyond that. It's offering us something greater, a chance to evolve." "Evolve?" I repeated, my voice tight with disbelief. "What does that even mean?" Lucian stepped closer, his faint smile widening. "You felt it too, Jonah. The hymn, the connection. It's not just sound, it's communication. It's showing us the world, its knowledge, its power. It's offering us a place in it." Elaine shook her head violently. "You've lost it. Whatever that thing did to you is not normal. Jonah, we need to stop this, whatever it takes." The sub lurched again, the cabin groaning under the strain. The lights flickered once more, and for a split second I thought I saw something outside. A faint glow twisting and curling in the water. The hymn's rhythm shifted. Its pulses were sharper now, more erratic. My vision blurred as images flashed through my mind, the creature's massive coils twisting through the chasm like rivers of liquid light, a city crumbling beneath the waves, its spires consumed by shadows, and Lucian standing at the edge of an abyss, his arms outstretched as the creature's tendrils curled around him like a shroud. The images vanished, leaving me gasping for air. Elaine's voice cut through the haze. "Jonah, we have to stop him before it's too late." Lucian smiled, his gaze distant. "Too late? No, Elaine. This is just the beginning." The sub groaned again, the vibrations rattling through the cabin as the hymn reached a fever pitch. The Aegir trembled under the strain of its own ascent, the thrusters fighting against a force far beyond the natural currents of the ocean. The hymn had become deafening, no longer a sound, but a presence that saturated every inch of the cabin. It was in the walls, the water, our minds. Elaine was shouting, her voice cutting through the cacophony, but it sounded so distant. "Jonah, the systems! Pressure spiking again!" I shook my head to clear it. "I see it," I barked, trying to steady my hands as the warnings of the console grew brighter and angrier. The sub's ascent slowed, and I realized with a jolt of horror that we weren't just being slowed. We were being dragged. It was pulling us back. If you enjoyed today's descent into the unknown, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment below. Your support helps keep the abyss from swallowing us whole. Or perhaps it only draws us deeper. New horrors await next week, so be sure to return if you dare. And as always, remember, just as we stare into the abyss, so too does the abyss stare back.